Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: The Shadows Whisper. Evelyn Harper rubbed her temples as she locked the front door behind her. It was late, and the soft glow of the moon barely illuminated the cobblestone street outside her new apartment. She had moved into this place 2 weeks ago, hoping for a fresh start after the breakup with Adam, her partner of 6 years. The quaint Victorian building, with its creaking floors and high ceilings, had seemed charming at first. Now it just felt empty. Evelyn tossed her keys on the narrow hallway table and kicked off her shoes. The apartment, though small, had an old-world charm that had initially drawn her in: wood-paneled walls, arched doorways, and a fireplace that hadn't worked in decades. But there was something about the bedroom that unsettled her. Every night, she felt as if the room grew colder the moment she turned off the lights. Shaking off her unease, she prepared for bed. As the hot water from the shower hit her skin, she scolded herself for letting her imagination get the better of her. It was just an old building, she reasoned. Old places made noises, and old walls held drafts. That was all there was to it. She climbed into bed with her laptop, scrolling aimlessly through streaming options before settling on a crime documentary. The narrator's monotone voice guided her to sleep as her eyes fluttered shut. Evelyn woke with a start, her body rigid. She blinked, trying to adjust to the darkness. Her laptop screen had gone black, casting the room in shadows. Her breath hitched as her gaze settled on the corner near the wardrobe. A shape, indistinct but there, hovered in the shadows. She froze, her heart pounding in her ears. The shape didn't move, but the longer she stared, the more it seemed to solidify. It wasn't a person, she told herself. It was a trick of the light, a combination of the wardrobe and the pile of clothes she hadn't put away. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the bedside lamp. The warm glow flooded the room, erasing the shape instantly. Evelyn let out a shaky laugh, berating herself for jumping at shadows. But as she lay back down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there. Over the next few nights, the same pattern repeated. Evelyn would wake up in the dead of night, her chest tight and her eyes drawn to the same corner. The shadow was always there, shapeless and still. She began to dread bedtime, lying awake for hours and watching the corner until exhaustion finally claimed her. By the 5th night, the lack of sleep had begun to wear on her. Dark circles underlined her eyes, and her usually sharp focus at work was slipping. "You look like you've seen a ghost," her coworker Claire joked over lunch. Evelyn forced a laugh, brushing off the comment. That night, she took an over-the-counter sleep aid, determined to get some rest. It worked for a while, until she woke again, heart pounding, to find the shadow closer. It wasn't in the corner anymore. It was at the foot of her bed. Her breath hitched as she stared, paralyzed. She couldn't see any details, but the presence felt heavy, oppressive. She reached for the lamp, her hand trembling so violently that it took 3 tries to find the switch. Light flooded the room, and once again, the shadow was gone. Evelyn confided in Claire the next day. "It's probably just stress," Claire said, though her brow furrowed with concern. "You've been through a lot lately. Maybe you should talk to someone like a therapist?" Evelyn nodded, but deep down, she wasn't convinced this was something a therapist could fix. That evening, she went online, searching for explanations. Her screen filled with articles about sleep paralysis and hallucinations. While the descriptions fit her experiences, none of them explained why the shadow seemed to move closer each time. Feeling both validated and unsettled, she decided to rearrange her bedroom furniture. She moved the bed away from the corner and positioned it against the opposite wall. It made her feel marginally better as she climbed into bed that night, hoping the change would break the cycle. Evelyn woke in the early hours to find the shadow again. This time, it wasn't in the corner or at the foot of her bed. It was standing beside her. Her breath caught in her throat as panic surged through her. She scrambled for the lamp, knocking over a glass of water in her haste. The light came on, and once again, the shadow was gone. But the fear remained, its icy grip refusing to let her go. Milo arrived the next day. Evelyn had adopted the puppy on impulse, hoping his presence would bring some warmth and comfort to her apartment. The tiny golden retriever was a ball of energy, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn felt a semblance of joy. That night, Milo curled up at the foot of her bed. His soft snores filled the room as Evelyn drifted into a fitful sleep. She woke once, but this time Milo was beside her, his small body pressed against her arm. She fell back asleep, comforted by his warmth. Though Milo's presence helped, the shadow didn't disappear. It returned every few nights, its position changing subtly. Sometimes it was near the door. Other times it seemed to loom near the wardrobe again. Milo would growl softly, his eyes fixed on the empty space where the shadow stood. Evelyn began documenting the occurrences in a journal. She noted the time, the position of the shadow, and how Milo reacted. The entries painted a chilling pattern. The shadow was growing bolder, its presence lingering longer each time. One night, Evelyn decided to stay awake. She brewed a pot of coffee and sat in her bed with Milo, determined to catch the shadow in the act. Midnight passed without incident, and she began to think she had imagined everything. But at 3 a.m., Milo began to growl. Evelyn's eyes darted to the corner, and there it was. The shadow seemed darker, more defined. Her breath quickened as it shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. She turned on the light, but this time, the shadow didn't vanish immediately. It lingered for a split second, fading slowly as if retreating into the walls. The next morning, Evelyn decided she couldn't ignore it anymore. She needed to understand what was happening in her apartment, and why the shadow had chosen her. Evelyn Harper sat at the kitchen table, her journal open in front of her. The pages were filled with hastily scribbled notes, timestamps, and crude sketches of her room. The shadow was no longer just a terrifying presence. It had become an obsession. She flipped through the entries, each one dredging up memories of sleepless nights and paralyzing fear. Milo padded across the kitchen floor, his claws clicking softly on the tiles. He nudged her leg with his nose, his tail wagging as if to remind her he was still there. Evelyn smiled faintly and reached down to scratch his ears. "You're my little protector, aren't you?" she murmured. Milo barked softly in response, his warm, reassuring presence a rare comfort. But no amount of wagging tails or puppy kisses could erase the shadow from her mind. Evelyn decided to dig into the history of her apartment. She started with an online search, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she typed in variations of Apartment 3C, building history, and unusual occurrences. The results were frustratingly mundane. Property listings, old reviews, and generic information about the neighborhood. Determined, she headed to the local library the next day. The library's archives offered a treasure trove of old property records and newspaper clippings. Evelyn spent hours poring over them, her eyes scanning for anything unusual. It wasn't until late afternoon that she found something. A small article from 1978 caught her attention. Local teacher found dead in apartment 3C. The accompanying photograph showed a grainy image of her building. The article described the tragic death of a woman named Margaret Hill, a beloved schoolteacher who had been found in her bedroom under mysterious circumstances. The cause of death was never determined, and no foul play was suspected. Evelyn's stomach churned as she read the final line. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises in the days leading up to Hill's death, but authorities dismissed the claims. She snapped a picture of the article with her phone and continued her search. Over the next few hours, she uncovered 2 more incidents tied to apartment 3C. A man who had disappeared in 1985 and an elderly tenant who had reportedly suffered a fatal heart attack in 1993. The pieces didn't add up to a clear pattern, but they painted a troubling picture. Armed with this new information, Evelyn decided to confront her landlord. Mr. Talbot was a wiry man in his 60s with a perpetually furrowed brow. When she mentioned the incidents, his expression darkened. "Miss Harper, I assure you, "This building is perfectly safe," he said, his tone defensive. "I'm not saying it isn't," Evelyn replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I just want to understand what's happening. I've been experiencing things in my apartment." Mr. Talbot's gaze shifted. "What kind of things?" "Shadows, noises, a feeling like I'm being watched." For a moment he said nothing. Then he sighed. "Look, this building is old. Creaks, it groans. Drafts can play tricks on the mind. I've been managing this property for over 20 years, and I've never had a tenant complain about anything supernatural." Evelyn wasn't convinced. As she left his office, she noticed the way his hands had trembled slightly, the way his eyes had darted away from hers. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, Evelyn purchased a basic surveillance camera. She set it up in her bedroom, positioning it to capture the corner where the shadow first appeared. That night, she lay in bed, her heart pounding as she stared at the blinking red light of the camera. Milo slept soundly beside her, his small body rising and falling with each breath. Evelyn woke the next morning to find the camera's battery drained. She frowned, certain she had charged it fully before going to bed. When she reviewed the footage, the screen was black for the majority of the recording. Only the first few minutes were visible, showing her climbing into bed and turning off the lights. Her frustration mounted as she replayed the footage, looking for anything unusual. That's when she noticed it. A faint flicker in the corner, so brief she almost missed it. Evelyn leaned closer to the screen, her breath catching. The flicker didn't look like a shadow or a light. It looked like movement. Evelyn decided to confide in Claire again. The two met at a nearby cafe, where Evelyn laid out everything she had discovered. Claire listened intently, her expression a mix of concern and skepticism. "I don't know, Evelyn," Claire said, stirring her coffee. "It sounds like you're scaring yourself. You've been through a lot lately, moving, the breakup. Maybe this is your mind's way of coping." Evelyn shook her head. "This isn't in my head, Claire. I've seen it. Milo's seen it. And now there's something on camera." Claire sighed. "Okay, let's say you're right. What's your plan?" "I don't know yet," Evelyn admitted. "But I'm not giving up." A week later, Evelyn came home to find her front door slightly ajar. Her heart raced as she stepped inside, clutching her phone tightly. The apartment looked untouched at first glance, but when she entered her bedroom, she froze. The surveillance camera was gone. Evelyn's chest tightened as she searched the apartment. Nothing else was missing. Not her laptop, not her jewelry, not even the cash in her wallet. Whoever had broken in had only taken the camera. She reported the incident to the police, but the officer who arrived seemed indifferent. "Probably just a prank," he said. "Kids these days do all sorts of stupid stuff." Evelyn wasn't convinced. 2 days later, Evelyn found an envelope taped to her door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words scrawled in messy handwriting. "Leave, before it's too late." Her blood ran cold. She called Claire, who insisted she come stay with her for a while. But Evelyn refused. She couldn't leave, not without understanding what was happening. That night, Evelyn sat in the living room with Milo at her feet. She had moved the remaining cameras to the living room and hallway, determined to catch whoever or whatever was tormenting her. Hours passed in silence. Just as she began to drift off, Milo let out a low growl. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, her heart pounding. The living room was dark except for the faint glow of the streetlights outside. Milo was staring at the hallway, his body tense. Evelyn grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight. She aimed it at the hallway, her breath hitching as the beam of light revealed the unmistakable outline of a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was there, standing motionless at the end of the hall. Evelyn's scream pierced the silence as she stumbled backward, her phone slipping from her hands. By the time she scrambled to turn on the lights, the shadow was gone. Evelyn sat trembling on the floor, her phone clutched in her hand. She had tried to dismiss the events as paranoia, but after seeing the shadow, her denial was no longer an option. She called Claire again, her voice shaking as she recounted what had happened. "Evelyn, you need to leave," Claire urged. Come stay with me. Whatever is going on in that apartment, it's not safe for you to be there. Evelyn hesitated. She wanted to run, but the warning note kept playing in her mind. Leave, before it's too late. Felt less like a threat and more like a plea. I can't, Evelyn said finally. I need to know what's happening. If I leave, I'll never understand why this is happening to me. Claire sighed, frustrated but resigned. Fine, but at least let me come over. You shouldn't be alone. Evelyn agreed reluctantly. While waiting for Claire, Evelyn revisited the articles she had found. Each victim in apartment 3C had been described as isolated, a detail that resonated with her own life. Her recent breakup, the distance from her family, and her struggle to make friends in a new city all painted a picture of someone vulnerable. She began to wonder if someone had been watching her, exploiting her loneliness. When Claire arrived, she brought an air of determination. We're going to figure this out, she declared, setting a duffel bag of supplies on the floor. Inside were flashlights, a portable charger, and a small toolkit. Evelyn smiled faintly. You came prepared. Better safe than sorry, Claire replied. That evening, the two women combed through the apartment. Claire focused on practical explanations, loose floorboards, gaps in the walls, faulty wiring, while Evelyn documented everything. It was Claire who made the first discovery. In the bedroom closet, she found a small, almost imperceptible hole in the wall. Peering through it, she realized it led to the adjacent apartment. Evelyn, she called, her voice tight. You need to see this. Evelyn's stomach dropped as she looked through the hole. It offered a clear view of her bed. That's how they're watching you, Claire said. Whoever's doing this, they've been here the whole time. Evelyn's mind raced. Could her neighbor in apartment 3B be responsible? The next morning, Evelyn and Claire knocked on the door of apartment 3B. A wiry man in his 40s answered, his face pale and his eyes sunken. Yes? He asked, his tone guarded. Evelyn's heart pounded. We need to ask you something. Have you been in my apartment? The man blinked, then laughed nervously. What? No. Why would I do that? Claire stepped forward. We found a hole in the wall that connects our apartments. Someone's been watching her. The man's expression darkened. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't have time for this. He slammed the door shut. Claire looked at Evelyn. He's hiding something. That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. Every creak and groan of the building set her on edge. Around 2 a.m. Milo started growling softly, his gaze fixed on the bedroom door. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone and tiptoed to the living room, where she found the hallway light flickering erratically. Milo followed closely, his body tense. Evelyn's breath caught when she noticed the faint sound of shuffling footsteps. They were coming from the ceiling. She stared upward, her mind racing. The attic. She had forgotten the building had one. The next morning, Evelyn convinced the building superintendent to unlock the attic. Claire joined her, armed with flashlights and a baseball bat. The attic was dark and cluttered, filled with dusty boxes and old furniture. As they searched, Evelyn's flashlight landed on something that made her blood run cold. A mattress surrounded by crumpled food wrappers and empty bottles. Someone's been living up here, Claire whispered. Nearby, they found a notebook filled with erratic handwriting. Many of the entries were incoherent, but one sentence appeared repeatedly. She's mine to watch. The police were called, and the investigation revealed a horrifying truth. The man from apartment 3B had been sneaking into the attic for years, using it as a hideout. He had drilled the hole into Evelyn's closet to spy on her, as he had with previous tenants. Confronted with the evidence, the man confessed. He claimed he was protecting Evelyn from the shadow, an entity he believed lived in the building. Though his ramblings were dismissed as the delusions of a disturbed mind, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story. Evelyn moved out of apartment 3C the following week. Claire helped her pack, and Milo seemed relieved to leave. As she settled into a new place, Evelyn began to rebuild her life. She adopted a more open lifestyle, reconnecting with family and friends. But the shadow remained in her memory, a reminder of how fragile safety could be. Months later, Evelyn received an anonymous letter in the mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words. "It's not over." Evelyn stared at the note, her hands trembling. Though she wanted to dismiss it as a cruel prank, a small part of her couldn't ignore the possibility that someone, or something, was still watching.